very much one of Mr. Johnson's greatest strengths is indeed he's a remarkable campaigner. And I think there is little gainsaying the argument that the victory that the Conservatives secured in 2019 was very, very much a product of, one, his success in getting the Northern Ireland Protocol tweaked a little bit, albeit he disowned it later, and then being able to bring together mostly voters behind the Conservative party. 80% of them voted for the party, and that was the foundation of the victory. And that is a reflection of his unrivaled ability as a campaigner. However, your ability as a campaigner does ultimately rest on whether or not the public are going to believe you. And after 2 years in office, when the Conservatives were never behind Labour in the polls, quite remarkably, once Partygate hit, then indeed, yes, the party did fall behind the polls. Now, it's true, they were actually, by the time he left office, the party was around 8 or 9 points behind. Was that potentially recoverable? Yes. Was it necessarily recoverable under Ms. Johnson? Not necessarily, given the view that the public had by then formed of him. But of course, much of the primary responsibility for the fact that the Conservatives are now so far behind in the polls doesn't lie with Mr. Sunak, but rather his immediate predecessor, Liz Truss. Now, of course, Liz Truss only got the opportunity because Tory MPs effectively brought Mr. Johnson down through the mass resignation from his government, which meant he could no longer sustain an administration. So he can say, well, that wasn't my fault. But in the end, it was the Liz Truss fiscal event that's caused the Conservatives real difficulty and puts them in the situation where at the moment, even under Mr. Sunak, somewhat less unpopular as he is than his party, the road back to being able to win the next general election looks like a very, very substantial challenge indeed. So, yeah, it's not all Mr. Johnson's fault, but I think Mr. Johnson does need to recognise that at least what it was Partygate and the fact that, frankly, his interpretation of what the Partygate rules did or did not allow, honest though that interpretation may have been, was so much at variance with what most of society was following, including, of course, those painful decisions that people faced of, not being able to visit loved ones with dementia in a care home, not being able to attend the funeral of even your married partner. That was so strongly embedded in the public mind that Mr. Johnson feeling that it was fine to hold a gathering in order to recognise the fact that somebody was leaving office. That, frankly, for most people just did not seem credible as a reasonable interpretation of the rules that everybody else thought that they were following. And given that this was the pandemic was so embedded in people's lives, so many people had to make painful choices. Therefore, I think it was always going to be very difficult for Mr. Johnson to recover from the public perception of him that emerged out of that 9 months of the Partygate.